For a good long time, we have talked about as a board and a community ways to reduce our expenses. I just got done having a conversation about tax increases, 7, 8, 9+%. And this board took a very aggressive and made a very difficult decision to say we've got to look internally as well. We can't just rely on outside revenue, and we can't just rely on having taxpayers foot the bill. So I've started every conversation regarding Indian Point or Entergy with this slide. This basically is who we are and what we're about, and it's an opportunity to celebrate. We have some of the lowest class size K through 5 in all of Westchester County. We have some of the most rigorous and most opportunities for high school kids to achieve college credit before they graduate through AP courses, 23 AP courses and 18 courses that we partner with colleges and universities for college credit. 85% of our kids that take an AP exam score at least a 3 or better, which basically is recognized by major universities for college credit. Number of students, almost 60% of our kids participate in athletics, which is very important. Our curriculum at the middle school provides 7 opportunities for kids to achieve high school credit, which makes opportunities for AP programs like Project Lead the Way or more electives more viable for them. So we start with this because this board has committed that while we may face some financial difficulty moving forward, we certainly are not going to do it at the expense of the kids and programs, or we're going to try really hard because this is what defines us. With the closure of Indian Point over that 5-year period, and this will start this fiscal year. So when Enrique and I meet with the Finance Committee next Wednesday, and as we start our budget presentations in January, this is when it hits. So this is when it happens. We are going to experience a $60.5 million revenue loss over 5 years. Indian Point right now accounts for about 30% of our revenue, around $25 million. It escalates as our budget does. So when 30% of your budget is blown away, you have to advocate, but you also have to look internally. And we've done a lot of different things. We have learned after Indian Point is closed that there's a cessation mitigation fund, which will, if it's fully funded, which it's not right now, but with the assumption that it will be fully funded, will cover some of our gap, but not all of it. And Enrique provided for the board and community a couple weeks ago that even with the cessation fund fully funded, we're still looking at tax increases between 7 and 9%. We've talked about business development in our district. In fact, it was about a year ago that the town of Cortland presented on what they're doing to try to increase business development. They're going to come back and give us an update in early January as we start the new year about efforts that are underway or potential deals in the works that will benefit us financially. And again, the goal is that the more businesses that can come in and eat up vacant land and build something will create taxable revenue, which will lessen the burden on those that live in the district. Nita Lowy, who is now our retiring Congresswoman, has proposed a number of bills in committee that basically would put some financial accountability on the federal government to pay a fee or basically rent for the spent nuclear fuel rods that will reside on the campus at Indian Point after Indian Point begins its closure process. That is mandated by federal law. So federal law says, okay, when you're a nuclear power plant and you're closing, we are going to regulate what you do with those spent fuel rods and how you need to create a safe storage and make sure that what you're doing is environmentally friendly. What Nita Lowy has presented is to say, okay, if that's federal government property, there should be some sort of revenue source that goes to those communities because that property cannot be flipped. It can't be used for other purposes. So it's basically rent, paying rent for space that's an opportunity lost for business development. Westchester County, we're not really happy to have our taxes increase, but Westchester County increased sales tax by 1%. So if you go to Dunkin' Donuts and your donut and coffee used to be $3, it's now about $3.04. That additional 1% in sales tax revenue has generated for the district a little over $600,000 of unanticipated revenue at the time. So, you know, while we want to save money out of one pocket, or not spend it out of one pocket, we're saving it out of another, because a little north of $600,000 in terms of taxes is about 1.5%. So the county contributing more to school districts has saved taxpayers 1.5%. And the last one is cost analysis study. This was a decision that the board made, basically saying we need an objective set of eyes looking at how we organize kids to see if we can save money to reduce the burden on taxpayers. And that's what my update here tonight is. So the question that the board asked at its retreat in August of 2018 was, can we organize students differently to reduce expenses? And we were asking this question and seeking three pieces of information. Can we configure elementary students differently? Can we have a different organization at the middle level, which I'll get into? And we wanted to look a little more closely at high school course enrollment. So, in August of 2018, the board committed at its retreat to review our organization and configuration in an effort to curb expenses and mitigate tax increases. This was met with some cheers because it was an opportunity to ask questions that the district hasn't always asked. It was met with some trepidation because it meant that we had to ask some questions that we otherwise wouldn't be asking if Indian Point wasn't closing. In November of 2018, we partnered with BOCES, and at the recommendation of the School Boards Association and the Superintendents Association and others, including PTA and references, we identified the consulting firm of Castillo and Silky to conduct the analysis. This is a consulting group out of Syracuse who have worked in education for many, many decades and who do these studies now for a profession. And it was important for the board, coming out of the August 28th conversation, was that it was a complete and legitimate third-party objective review. I will tell you, I have my opinions. I had my opinions going into the discussion. Margaret may have Lisa. We form our opinions based on our experience and based on what research tells us. It was important, and the board had their own opinions at the time, and the board suspended their opinions and their judgment and wanted a third-party review so that it could be as clean and sanitized as possible. So from December of 2018, when BOCES hired the consulting group, so they basically spent the last year collecting data. They conducted a site visit last June. We had multiple conference calls, we had follow-up meetings, we shared documents back and forth, and then we reviewed the reports, which is basically tonight's conversation. Here's an example of some of the data that they looked at. Very, very thorough analysis. I'll tell you that the report, the completed report, is over 80 pages long and has multiple tables with their data sets, with their methods of how they collected their data. It's a very thorough report. They looked at some things that you would think you wouldn't know why you're looking at when you're talking about how could you save money by reorganizing students differently. But this is just an example, and I won't bore you by reading the bullets. So they came up with 4 recommendations. Some popular, some not popular, but this is basically the meat of the report, and this is a quote pulled exactly from the report. So the first recommendation is to do nothing, basically, to say that we have organized our elementary students in 3 elementary schools for a long time. That concept has been embraced, and that by doing nothing or maintaining the status quo, you have 3 elementary schools based on enrollment by neighborhood, serving kids grades K through 5. Option 2, or recommendation 2, would be a grade center plan using 3 schools. In education terms, this is called the Princeton Plan. This is where you take all of your students district-wide and you identify schools and you have students move by school as a cohort by grade level. It's basically very similar, or it's the elementary version of the middle school and high school. And so recommendation 2 would say you would have a K-1 school, you'd have a 2-3 school, you'd have a 4-5 school. And by moving students in larger cohorts together, you create a great deal of efficiencies. And analyzing current and projected enrollment based on staffing and program that we have K-5, we would save about $1 million, $1 million of our budget.
A year.
I'm sorry?
A year.
A year. $1 million a year. All right, that's just in staffing. All right, $1 million a year to those who live in our community and pay taxes is about 2.5% of tax revenue. So you could look at it 2 ways. You would save, your taxes would be reduced by $2.5 million, or they wouldn't your taxes would be reduced by 2.5%, or they wouldn't increase by 2.5%. Okay. Recommendation 3 is a grade center plan using 2 schools. This would create a K-2 school and a 3-5 school. We have a 3rd school. That 3rd school in this recommendation would be closed. You would have all of the advantages of option 2, which basically is a Princeton plan, but you would squeeze more kids into fewer schools and try to identify increased savings, and you would. This plan would generate $1.5 million savings each year by closing a school. Option 4 would be a grade center plan with 2 schools and move 5th grade to the middle school. This gets a little more involved, but basically you would have a K-2 school. You'd have a K-2 school. You'd have a 3 and 4 school, and then 5th grade would move to the middle school. This plan also would save $1.5 million. So $1.5 million in tax terms is about 3.5%, a little more than 3.5%, almost 4% in taxes. So the more aggressive we are in terms of these recommendations, the greater the savings. Now, there are educational benefits and challenges to each of them. The full report outlines some of them. Our recommendation would be to study an option or a recommendation in greater detail with our folks to underscore benefits or challenges based on our programs and our needs and our students and the physical layout of our schools. So there they are. And what we've learned through this process and through this 80-plus page report that we will release to the public in a day or two, and our staff also, is that we're not alone. A lot of school districts go through this process. It wasn't long ago that Katona-Lewisboro went through this process. It wasn't long ago that our district went through this process a little more than a decade ago. School districts across New York State are looking at ways to save expenses without jeopardizing student programs and opportunities. Why is a concept like a Princeton plan or a grade level plan, regardless of closing a school or moving 5th grade, why does that generate so much savings? Is because you have efficiencies, you create efficiencies. You have more kids in the same place at the same time that likely need the same service. I started this presentation talking about 19 kids per classroom on average in our elementary school. That's a great number on average. That's an average. We have a kindergarten classes in a particular school with 14, and we have kindergarten classes in another school with 24. So as I run around and say we have 19 kids per class, that's an average. That's not everywhere. So when you look at why we have middle schools or high schools and why they're more efficient, it's because you're able to direct your resources in a more efficient manner. You're able to address more student need in a more consistent and concise way. School districts in our own region have organized themselves differently for many different reasons. Cultural, some are financial. Margaret and I have had a lot of conversations about her professional experience, especially in Peekskill. She worked in Peekskill when they were, right, when you went from one to another.
Neighborhood to grade level.
Yorktown has a different kind of model. School districts are organized for many, many different reasons, but they're talking about potentially organizing themselves differently for financial reasons. And the majority of these school districts that are having this discussion are born out of the property tax cap, are born out of the potential risk of exceeding the property tax cap and trying to get a supermajority of your public to approve a budget beyond a tax cap. So districts are looking internally and they're making some very, very tough decisions. And any decision we make or a decision that we don't make is going to generate an immense amount of emotional response. You talk about, a third grader no longer attending the school they've been in and are going to go to a different school for purposes of saving money. That is a very legitimate and valid concern that parents would have. But we also know that a majority of our residents in our school district no longer have kids in the district. And you have heard from them, I have heard from them. If Barbara was here, she would chime in and say that we go on tour to the senior citizen groups each spring to talk to them about the budget. And they want to know what we're doing to mitigate their costs. And sometimes when you're in it, when you're in the elementary school, it's hard, as a parent, it's hard to see outside of it. But I've had conversations with parents who, when we started this study a year ago, I'll never let you do this, and then their youngest kids are in middle school and they're saying, it's not that, not that big of a deal, or perhaps it's not, a horrible option. And when you start putting dollar signs on things, and you start communicating with people with regards to their pocketbook in an environment where we're going to ask them, residents, to pay anywhere between 6 and 9% more in taxes, sometimes their position changes. When this district had the conversation about potential moving to a Princeton plan a decade plus ago, it was for all the right reasons. It was about equity, it was about balance, it was about program, it was about special needs kids, for all the right reasons. And that didn't garner enough support. But to have this conversation and say we could reduce taxes, the tax burden anywhere between 2.5% and 4.5%, that gets people's attention a little bit differently when you're looking at increases between 7 and 9 plus. So we have also learned that there are many options to explore. We also know that doing nothing is an option. And that we would, we're okay with what we have. It wasn't an issue before, and our outcomes are great, as I spoke earlier. And the other thing we have is we have some time for further research and discussion. Tonight is not a decision-making, what do we want to do? We talked in our board retreat that we want to be very, very thorough. We want to be very, very transparent. We want to be very involved and engaging and making sure we have input from all the different stakeholders in our community. So the process of how we move forward is going to dictate what kind of outcome we have. And so let me talk about some proposed next steps that really are good practice. The group, consulting group that did the study, as I said, they've done dozens of these statewide in communities like ours and very rural communities. And this basically is best practice. One option to move forward is for the board to eliminate options that are not of interest. I'll put my finger on the scale. I will tell you that today, right now, we don't have enough information to suggest that closing a school is a good option. We're going to be in some enrollment limbo, perhaps. We have declining enrollment in our school district. And one of the reasons that's been suggested that we have declining enrollment is because we have a low availability of housing. Why do we have fewer houses for sale than our neighboring school districts? Because it's really super affordable to live here if you don't have kids in the district anymore. It's basically return on investment. My colleagues, our colleagues in other districts, you pay a premium to live and send your kids to public schools in Westchester. You pay a big premium. And in many other communities close to us, Yorktown, Briarcliff, a little further south, Pleasantville, Chappaqua, their school taxes are significantly higher, and families make a decision that they may not stick around after their youngest graduates, that they don't experience the return anymore. A high property tax, we're the second highest, we pay the second highest property taxes in the country. And some families believe that, okay, I'm not getting a benefit from, my kids aren't getting a benefit from the school anymore, I'm going to sell my house. We don't have that experience because our taxes are so artificially low because of the strength of the Indian Point pilot. I think closing a school, not knowing the impact of homes that potentially could come for sale, and families moving in with young children, that would be a grave mistake. And we can get into this at a later date, but when you close a school, it's hard to reopen it. It's almost impossible. And some of the most detrimental decisions that districts have made, or municipalities, have been to close or sell one of their facilities. If they aren't really ready and if they don't have good hardcore data to support it. What we have learned is in the almost 3 years, it will be 3 years in about a month, in the 3 years since Indian Point announced their closure, this has been the hottest the housing market has been in our district in 12 years. Prices are up, homes are selling, they're going to contract, days on market are down, and part of the reason that the real estate professionals are talking about is folks, for whatever reason, who may not have been paying attention to our school district as a place to move and raise their kids, their issue may have been Indian Point. Their views on nuclear power, their views on environmental concerns, their views on safety concerns, those are going to be mitigated as the plant closes, and that's some of the data or just some of the conversations that real estate agents are suggesting of one of the reasons why our housing market is starting to gain speed. So you certainly don't want to be short-sighted and close the school to save money today when you're going to need the space later. So one of the proposed next steps is at some point is to eliminate options that we don't find are feasible. Another recommended next step is to commit to not implementing anything until September of 2021 at the earliest. That this is not a, I give a quick presentation, you read an 80-page report, and you say, okay, we'll do this, Joe and folks, can you, get this done in 6 months? Another proposed next step is, as I've talked about a few times, we'll publish the analysis. It will be a free and open document. The document the board has is going to be made available. We're going to send out a notice to everyone and put a link. It's 80 pages, so read online, don't print it. We would schedule school-based meetings and community meetings, roundtable meetings, PTA meetings, very similar to how we handled the capital project about 2 years ago. Throughout January and February to seek input, to talk about the recommendations in a little more detail and breadth and depth. And finally, to commission a committee to explore feasible options that the board would like to look a little deeper in. A Princeton plan will save us $1 million+. Okay, well, what would that look like here? What schools would different kids go to? Are those schools equipped? Are there enough restrooms? If Laura were here, she'd say, well, do we need to move the monitors or the technology, furniture, a lot of specifics, playground equipment, things that aren't necessarily at the forefront would need to be vetted and to determine, is that feasible here?
We've been talking a lot of dollars and cents. I'm hoping that part of the analysis of these different options would also be educational impact on the kids from costs.
Yeah, so in the report, there is a, very sort of brief but research-based bullet point description of benefits and, positives, negatives, disadvantages, what have you. We would take any of the options that the board would wish us to explore with greater depth and breadth, and we would make that analysis specific to Hendrick Hudson based on our special ed programs, based on our enrichment programs, our curriculum needs, so on and so forth. So we would go from what research says to what does it mean for us. Absolutely.
And also, any idea has its problems. If we go to the Princeton plan, then our transportation either will increase or will have to move the bells 20 minutes more apart. So there's,
Look at that as well.
Yeah,
there's
those are-
issues, there's
Well, that's what
side
you're saying about,
effects.
exactly,
Yeah.
about making it, how it affects Penn HUD. I mean, how it looks on paper versus the reality. Yep.
The numbers you have up there are savings just based on comp and ben, or payroll,
Yep.
right? So there are significant costs and potential other savings that are not accounted for
Correct.
in those numbers. So we shouldn't be basing our,
Absolutely not.
any decision on
No,
that number. It's
absolutely
gotta be
not.
more around
Oh, yeah.
education, and it's gotta be more around what's right for the community and what makes sense.
The eliminating options that are not feasible, which in a nutshell means not, eliminating the closing the buildings option. When do you think we might want to discuss that or be ready to discuss that?
You tell me. It's
So I think that before we do anything about that, we need to do a study, a birth study. We used to do it every 10 years.
it's in there.
Demographics.
The live birth is in
It's
there. Yeah.
Well, I think we absolutely, the conversation needs to start like immediately. I mean, obviously it's been going on, but I mean, it's to really, start considering it and start getting, and frankly, the community input as well. Once this gets online and people can start looking at it and, sort of figuring out, putting their own approaches and their own experiences and, what knowledge they have as well.
It's a lot to digest, and it's a big document. And as I said, I can't stress this enough, it's going to elicit emotional reactions that are valid. But we started this study to say, can we maintain the excellence that we've had by organizing things differently? And that will be the education analysis.
But that's the priority.
That's
At
the
end of the
priority.
day, That's the priority.
Yep.
I
So maybe
will-
we can chat about it again next
The
meeting
18th.
and see if there are any options that we can definitely take off the table, or if we need more information
When will
about all
this go
four
online?
before we do
Tonight?
that.
Tomorrow?
I was going to put together basically a letter to our school community saying we had this discussion, go through the timeline, the report's available, and here's how we're going to respond to the report, essentially in January. I'll make the rounds with PTA and just sort of talk about it and let people know that no decisions have been made, but really talk about process. So, probably in 2 weeks, it would be a good time for us to talk about the process we
So
should
it
go
gives more of a
through.
timeframe, too.
And a timeframe. I think it will, this study took a year, and it's very comprehensive, and there were a lot of edits and back and forths and meetings and follow-ups. Any option we explore will be as vigorously researched. I think part of the recommendation to try to narrow down the options will help that process. We don't want to go fast, but
But
we will be able to expedite it.
Narrow the focus.
We know what status quo means. Keep doing what we're doing, and
Right.
you know what? If the savings aren't there, okay, because we've been doing it. Two options are to close the school, and another option is to organize K through 5 differently. So, that's basically the analysis. We have, of the 4 options, 3 of them require a physical change as to where students go to school.
Are we going to talk about the middle level and the high school at some point?
So in the report are class size analyses that we pulled together for high school and middle school. The one option that impacts middle school is 5th grade going there. So we would have to really get into some of the space needs and some of the.
Room?
What, I'm sorry?
Would they do the analysis that there would be room?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I don't know.
And the high school.
The closing.
And-
Yeah, I didn't remember that.
In the high school piece, you'll see class size and sections. We offer a lot of programs. We are very proud of those programs, and sometimes those programs don't have a lot of kids. Not too long ago, one of our AP courses had a handful plus of kids in it. We had a discussion of whether we cancel that capstone AP class, and we realized that it was important that we follow through on our commitment to those families who made a decision back in 6th grade when they chose, to accelerate their child, or, families are making some decisions as early as 6th grade based on assurances or assumptions that those programs will be there for kids. This board, maybe 5+ years ago, talked a lot about science acceleration and math acceleration with our Project Lead the Way science research. Those are commitments that we make to parents and kids at a really early age, and assurances that decisions you make now will provide opportunities later. So the high school analysis of the report will get into some of those class size pieces. And there are schools who have handled low enrollment differently. They have had a hard cap and have canceled courses, no questions asked, and then those kids would need to filter in other places. Some districts have said, go to community college if you want college level courses. We're not going to offer them here.
Yeah, but that's beyond this conversation.
Well,
I mean, it's a part of it, but it's.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that's part of the high school analysis that's in there. We've been afforded good financial times to be able to offer all of those courses to kids, and but the other option is to put them on rotation, to say these courses are going to go every other year, so you can't take it now, you'll take it later.
Plan accordingly.
Plan accordingly, but that still goes back to families making decisions in 8th grade for kids based on opportunities in grades 9 through 12.
So how are we going to communicate this to non-school families? Because you said we're going to send out a communication to the school community. How are we going to involve the folks outside of the school community?
So we have we think a pretty good email list of who those folks are, because each year we try to send a designated communication to those families who no longer have kids in the district. Basically to say, your kids aren't here, maybe you've never had kids in the district, I'm an example of that, but here's your return on investment. Here's what we're doing with your tax dollars. So we think we have a pretty good email and hard copy list, but we may need to send a paper notice home, just like we do the budget, and that's not cheap, but that's the only way to guarantee everyone has heard the same thing in the same way.
Senior groups.
We'll go to the senior groups. We'll use all the
That's a
standard
big
communication
library.
tricks that we use around
Library,
budget
yeah.
time or for the bond or any major initiative.
Cool. Thank you.
So I would, read the report. It's 80 pages, good reading, a lot of interesting data, and in 2 weeks we could have a discussion of whether or not there's consensus to eliminate some or focus on others, and then we'll put a process together of communicating the report to everyone starting in the new year, and then putting a process together of how to dig a little bit deeper to determine what's feasible.
How are we going to gather or solicit feedback from the community? Are we going to have some way for them to email a specific address so that it can be reviewed?
Yep, so we've done that in the past. We've published Q&As for people to sort of look at before they send emails. We've done standalone emails for specific issues like the code of conduct or the safety plan or the bond. So certainly we would plan on doing that. We would load everything onto a specific webpage, part of our website, so that this discussion or presentation could be there, this document, the 80-page study, and be as visible in the community as possible. I think leading up to the bond vote in 2018, we did around 12 to 15 meetings that were not part of a board meeting. They weren't that well attended, and that led to, a landslide support. So maybe folks, were okay with what they were hearing through other channels, but the best way to communicate is to say, here's where we'll be and here's when, and let's have that discussion and try to not make it as formal and stuffy, but more Q&A. I think the immediate need is to get the information that you have to everybody, and then put a feedback process in place in January. But it's going to be labor intensive, because otherwise you get stuck in the emails back and forth. We're going to have to do some face-to-face and some roundtable like discussions about it. PTAs will be involved using PTA meetings. But
Would a survey maybe help in a
I
situation
think
like
if-
this to standardize
I think if we get
responses,
closer,
input from the community?
I think if we get closer to the board saying, okay, we're at the point where we've eliminated an option or two, we're really focusing on feasibility of a particular option, here's all of our information that we've gathered, let us know your thoughts. There are pros and cons to surveys. Surveys aren't always reliable. You don't always get, you get that, you get the feedback you ask for, but response rate isn't always that great.
It's not always as broad. You get a different group might be more
Also-
receptive to doing it. To
Also, the
responding as
integrity of the
others.
response in a survey is really tough to guarantee.
Yep.
So, you don't necessarily know who's responding,
Yep.
and there could be stuffed responses, fake responses, which is not a great,
Yeah.
it's a data point. It's
Yep.
not you can't fully rely on it.
But, I think that's part of our discussion in terms of process. If and when we get to a decision-making point, if status quo is not going to be our path and we're seriously considering or exploring something different, we may need a survey, but sometimes they're just not real reliable. And the other thing is
A lot of FaceTime, lots and lots of FaceTime.
Yeah, input is really
Yep.
critical, and when you're talking to people face to face, that makes a much bigger difference than having an online survey.
I'll reference when we started this process, when the board committed to investigating this back in August of 2018, Margaret and I met with, we went to the 3 elementary schools, because that was sort of either the rumor or the thought, closing an elementary school Princeton plan, and we basically said someone else is going to do this analysis, our fingerprints are not going to be on it, they shouldn't be on it. And there were 2 camps. One camp is, okay, kids are kids, my curriculum's my curriculum, if it can save some money, provide, maybe additional opportunities. And then there was another camp that basically said, okay, just give me enough advance warning because I'm going to retire, because I don't want to move, I don't want to be anywhere else. And that, is funny as that sounds, that's a real belief too, that, schools have their own DNA and create their own culture. And when you disrupt that culture, it generates different emotions. But we have heard in no uncertain terms that, there would be people who would say, okay, I'm good, I don't want to be part of what it will look like for whatever reason. So, it will be, we will hear from a lot of different folks with a lot of different opinions, as we should.
Yes. But
the reality is, I'm going to suggest that if Indian Point wasn't planning to close, we probably wouldn't be here addressing this issue from initially a financial standpoint. It wouldn't have been as urgent. So what our team will do is, we'll research, how this could work or why it might not, based on our programs and kids and outcomes, and that will be part of the analysis. We could save a lot of money real quickly and do a lot of harm to kids. That's not the intent, and that's not why the board undertook this aggressive and potentially thankless journey back in 2018, but it's asking the hard questions. And we're in a financial position where we need to ask the hard questions, and that's what this is. Okay? So we'll put it on the agenda for discussion in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
All right.